Hello everybody and welcome to the ISO 2400.org webinar on sustainability and sport. I'm Shaun McCarthy, I'm a Director of Action Sustainability, and we sponsor this global website on largely subjects around sustainable procurement, and it's a free to access knowledge sharing website with lots of content, best practice, videos, tools, etc. around sustainable supply chain management in various languages and from various countries around the world. In the last few months, we've been running some webinars around subjects that might be of interest to our audience. We've had a number of very successful webinars which you can access the recordings through the website. Today we're talking about sustainability and sport. The major events have long had a reputation for wastefulness and some issues around human rights, labour standards, etc. And there's a lot of organisations around the world that are coming together to try and do something about that. I'm going to talk a little bit myself before introducing the next speaker. Do feel free to put questions in the chat as we go through the session today, and then there's plenty of time at the end of each speaker's presentation to have some discussion so we can start to really explore the issues that are of interest to you and are of interest to the world. The reason that I'm going to introduce myself first and speak a little bit first is in a former life I chaired an organisation called the Commission for a Sustainable London 2012. At the time, this was a unique organisation. I still think it's probably quite unique in that it was an independent assurance body. My job was to oversee the sustainability performance of the London 2012 programme, from construction through to staging the Olympic Games in London and through to the legacy of the London 2012 programme. That commission actually finished in 2013. I reported independently to the public and directly to the political leaders. So I reported to the Mayor of London and to the Olympics Minister at the time. And we discovered lots of things. I'm not going to dwell too much on the successes. I'm going to really focus on particularly one of the challenges and then introduce our next speaker. So yeah, London 2012 moved the bar. Certainly in the construction sector, the standards of sustainability that were expected were exceptional, and the fact that the contractors were actually expected to deliver and measure their success and their performance on the programme was quite amazing. The London 2012 food vision was quite exemplary at the time and certainly moved the bar in terms of local sustainably sourced food, etc. So a lot of good things were done. The Mayor of London at the time the Olympics bid was won, Ken Livingstone, used to talk about London 2012 as being a 200-year regeneration project interrupted by 6 weeks of sport, which is probably not great for the sports fans out there. But Ken's point was the East End of London has traditionally been a very deprived community. The idea was for the Olympics to be a catalyst for development and for regeneration in that part of London. And that's still a work in progress, but it was largely successful. So coming on to the challenges then, I think the big challenge that we discovered was one around human rights. Human rights specifically in supply chains for things like merchandise, but more widely in the sense of the issues of abuse in sport teams, issues of prostitution in it acts as like a magnet, unethical practices potentially by sponsors. And what we discovered after the games when we reflected on this was an Olympic Games or any major sport event usually happens once in a country and then it moves on. So an organization comes together very, very quickly and then disbands immediately after the games. And the supply chain only has one shot at delivering. So in some cases where things like child labour and forced labour were discovered in the supply chains of merchandise for the Olympics, by the time they were investigated, that factory had moved on to making something else. All the cuddly toys for the Olympics had been made. So we didn't have that continuity. So one of the things that we looked at was, could there be an organization somewhere in the world that's a place where organisations can kind of coalesce around some of these really tricky and long-term human rights issues. I was really delighted at the time that the Institute for Human Rights and Business actually took up that challenge, and we now have a Centre for Human Rights and Sport, which leads me nicely on to our next speaker, William Rook, who's their Deputy Chief Executive. So, William, would you like to take up the story from there and tell us a bit about the work of your organisation?
No, thank you, Shaun, and happy to be here, and thank you for the invitation. I think that sets out the groundwork and some of the background to this, because I think we've all seen over a long history that sports events can both have, as you say, this kind of regenerative power and this positive impact in the communities and in the states that they take place, but also they come with risks, and those risks might be intensified given the compressed timeframes, given the complex sort of delineation of responsibilities of different actors involved in delivering the events, and in terms of, as you say, the complex supply chains brought together for a very short project. And maybe that's a particular challenge when you're looking at infrastructure and construction, where you have different companies involved at different bits and different stages of the development, and then they're out of the project again. And it's that kind of leverage that you have as a local organizing committee might be limited. And I guess that's balanced with the fact that perhaps expectations are higher on sport to deliver exemplary practice. It's it's often a competitive bidding process that awards an event to a particular location. They come with a great degree of prestige and profile. They invite the spotlight in certain respects, but they're also not always essential pieces of infrastructure that are being built. This is in some ways a nice to have sports events. It's a positive sort of social event that's being brought together. And as society, should we have even higher expectations that these events are delivered to really exemplary standards? You've also got the prospect in hosting events of sort of innovating and developing good and new practices that can then become examples in other sectors, or can flow outside of the fence of the project and be positive examples. And we see some of those around London 2012, and we see some of those at more recent sports events too, that they can serve as that positive domestic example of good practice. However, as you say, there's a great deal of disconnect between these events, despite sort of formal handover processes and transfer of learning. There's very little sort of cross-pollination of experiences and expertise from between different sporting traditions, I suppose, so between the Olympic Games, FIFA, other types of events, and also from one host city or host state to the next. And so the idea coming out of some of the work that the Institute for Human Rights and Business did with yourself and others in London 2012 was to launch a Centre for Sport and Human Rights. And that process really took some energy from the work around the London Olympics. We saw in 2014 that the Glasgow Commonwealth Games became the first Commonwealth Games with its own human rights policy. And then we moved into a period where there were a series of high-risk mega sporting events. And you could say events in Russia, moving to events in Qatar, the Rio Olympic Games. You see, to a degree, a kind of Groundhog Day of the continued same human rights impact. You see the resettlement of people from local communities to make way for event infrastructure. You see standards of policing and law enforcement and security being questionable. You see, yes, indeed, the treatment of athletes and fans, safeguarding of young people, children, both as athletes and as local people to events. And on top of that, the supply chains that deliver the whole event. And so what can be done to then create a sort of common body of knowledge and expertise that transfers that from one event to the next? And through working with many organizations, starting in 2015, we at the Institute for Human Rights and Business worked to launch then in 2018 the Centre for Sport and Human Rights. And we've done so in partnership with a number of sports bodies, including FIFA and UEFA, sponsors of sports events and sporting organizations like Visa and Adidas, trade unions, including the International Trade Union Confederation and Building and Woodworkers International, the likes of Amnesty and Human Rights Watch, a number of national human rights institutions, World Players Association, so the athletes, an important part of this. So with the whole sort of ecosystem of actors in sport, and I think this all possible because the work was chaired by Mary Robinson, who we all know as the former President of Ireland and High Commissioner for Human Rights, made it possible to coalesce all of these different stakeholders and create a common mandate for a Centre for Sport and Human Rights to be this repository of knowledge, to advance practice, and to be a place where all of these actors can meet. And just again, to go a little bit further, we see expectations still very high and rightly high on events, but we've seen progress too in that time. So you see FIFA adopting a human rights policy, embedding human rights into its statutes. You see the IOC integrating human rights into the host city contracts for Paris 2024 and Los Angeles 2028. You see UEFA including human rights as part of the assessment criteria for deciding the host of the next 2024 Euros. So human rights dimension is part of the assessment criteria. You see FIFA including human rights as a component of the bid process for the 2026 World Cup and part of the assessment that was put in place for selecting the United 26 bid. And now the United 26 bid using a human rights criteria as part of its host city selection for determining host cities. And so each of the host cities in North America seeking to be host cities for the 26 World Cup is publishing a human rights strategy in the next 12 months. And part of that is to determine the hosts of the host cities for the World Cup. And so you see really a lot of human rights policies and criteria now filtering through. And that obviously then filters into the contracts that those hosting agencies have with their suppliers, and filters into sustainable sourcing codes and the need for human rights compliant grievance mechanisms where workers can raise grievances and complaints in relation to the supply chains into the events, and into how the events themselves manage their own operations. And an example of this would be in Qatar for the World Cup in 2022, a really comprehensive worker welfare program in place around the construction elements of the World Cup. So that the elements that the local organizing committee controls there in terms of building stadiums are subject to really rigorous worker welfare standards that go above national legislation and have third-party inspections and have trade union inspections as well. So you see that kind of operationalized there. You see in Tokyo ahead of the Olympic Games, human rights embedded in the sustainable sourcing code. You see a grievance mechanism where workers in the supply chains can raise grievances directly. Now that's not necessarily been the most effective grievance mechanism. I think a lot of the complaints that came through to it were considered out of scope, and it wasn't available in many languages, and these types of practical problems. But you see the expectation there, and that pressure is being put that these types of mechanisms are in place. So I think, yeah, all that to say that since London 2012, Shaun, and your introduction, we've seen a lot of movement, a lot of commitments, and I think now a real expectation that human rights is part of the expectations for the delivery of sport and sports events. Now is the time where the rubber hits the road, really, because it's these commitments are now in place, these clauses are in the contracts, but we have yet to move into the phase of these events being delivered fully in compliance with those new standards. And so, you know, we also see last month the IOC released a report around integrating human rights within its own governance structure. And these types of things continue to move, and there's lots of big challenges on the horizon because sports events are local communities are increasingly skeptical of having sports events in their backyards, which means that more and more of them are going to places that can throw money at hosting them and may want to enhance their reputations by doing so, that may be places where human rights are more at risk. And so, you know, we've seen the Ice Hockey World Cup being scheduled to be in Belarus, that now being taken away by, in part, sponsor action. Increasing events going to places like Saudi Arabia. and the challenges will be there. I think you can look at that as sports washing, but also it's an opportunity for sports bodies to set standards in taking their events to these places that drive better performance and leave a positive legacy. That's what we want to see, is that there's not complicity, but there's real due diligence undertaken, a real assessment of the risk of taking an event to a particular location, and a real positive legacy from it being there. That's not just a sort of broad exclamation of the power of sport, that it actually has substance to it, that it has conditions to it, that it has sort of transparency built in, and yeah, there's adherence to international human rights standards in doing so. And yeah, these issues don't stop. You see the sort of tidal wave of athlete abuse claims coming out, and you see the lack of preparedness for sports bodies to deal with these in a way that properly can handle those types of serious grievances. You see safeguarding of children and young athletes. You see esports on the rise and all the challenges around esports that's really ungoverned. And so yes, we think there's these opportunities to advance good practice and reduce risk, and hopefully in de-risking sport, it de-risks the potential impact on people, and it safeguards the future of sport, really, so that those who take part in it can be safe in doing so, and those that deliver the events don't cause harm in doing so. So that's very sort of broad sort of march through, Shaun, but happy to have a discussion on any of these points and to engage with others on the broader topic of sport and human rights, as we see it really something rising up in the world. So yeah, thank you.
Thanks, William. Yeah, I'm, personally, obviously, really pleased to see that organisation exists, following the some of the challenges that we highlighted through the London 2012 programme. So I'd like to move on. I've got dozens of questions for William, but I'll hang fire until we've heard from the rest of the speakers, and also encourage any of you on the call, if you have questions, do please feel free to pop them into the chat. If I can move on to Megan Jones from the Ocean Race, if you'd like to introduce yourself, and then we'll start to explore some of the topics that William has given us.
Yeah, for sure. Thanks for having me, Shaun, and great to hear what you've had to say there, William. So I'm from the Ocean Race. We're an around the world sailing race. We used to be the Volvo Ocean Race, and we've been around since 1973. It started off as the Whitbread around the world race. And so we're coming on 50 years, and we go around the world every 4 years or so. We've delayed because of COVID. So our last race is 2017-18, and our next race will be 22-23. But we do have a race in Europe this year as well, all things being equal. So yeah, we do have 10 host cities, and you'll be happy to know that we do go through a rigorous selection process, and without exception, every host city that we've got coming up in the next edition has sustainability as its key, attraction, as in why they wanted to host us. And we're also very lucky that the ocean is our racetrack. We don't need a stadium. So we use existing facilities quite well. So yeah, so that's a good one for us. But I'm going to go a little bit granular, because I know that you're talking about sustainable procurement here. So I thought I'd bring to the discussion today a particular area that our sector's focusing on.
So, Megan, you've discovered some pinch points, I think, around delivery of sustainable events. What are they, in your opinion, and how do we deal with them?
Yeah, so you kind of missed the plastic issue, obviously, in the last few years, and the Ocean Race had that plastic pollution, single-use plastic, as one of its major key purpose-led issues. And we obviously practice what we preach, so we did a lot of intervention in the site, of course, as we went around the world. But looking, with this COVID year, with the industry, especially the sustainable events professionals around of us, have had a lot of time to get together and to chew on some of the big issues. And one of them, what we think, although it's unquantifiable at the moment, where we're trying to get some numbers together, is possibly the biggest single-use plastic issue of events, and that's the way that we dress and brand our sites. So in the events world, it's called look and overlay, or branding, obviously signage. So everything that decorates and dresses these sites. So it can be all the kilometres of fencing, or cloaking an entire stadium and what have you. And yeah, so we did a market review and deep sort of industry study, and came together with about 120 industry professionals back in May last year to talk through those pain points that we identified in, of how we're going to get to a sustainable state with the way that we dress our sites. So I guess you want to hear what those pain points are.
Yeah, we'd certainly love to hear about the pain points.
So yeah, I mean, it's quite unique, obviously, with events. The temporary nature of events is our biggest hurdle. And, coupled with that is the look and feel of an event changing. The designers get involved there, different sponsors, moving from one venue to another, one destination to another. So between events, you've got very, very different setups. So that temporary nature was one of our sort of inherent big issues. But interestingly, and I think that people on the call today could probably relate to this in their area as well, is lack of leadership and siloism. So it's almost like the stewardship of the problem along the value chain. And that was a big one for us. So you've got your designers cooking up amazing ideas. You've got your practical site people who've got the things that they need to get done. You've got the production houses that are set up in a certain way to produce things in a certain size. If the design goes 10 centimeters over, then you've got double the amount of raw materials because that's as wide as the machine. So there's that whole siloism thing. And especially with material stewardship, the designers and the site managers and the producers aren't necessarily involved with thinking of end of life. And so they're not designing for the closing day and what happens thereafter. So that was a big one. And wrapping all of this up is lack of knowledge, not only of the issues or the solutions, but that it's an issue actually that we need to think about. So I quite often say when we're in, our working groups and stuff, imagine it's 1983 and we're a group of people coming together and thought, we've got an amazing idea. Let's put recycling bins at events. At that point, no one was thinking, oh, you'd talk to a worn out, gnarly site manager and they'd be like, recycling bins, what are you talking about? So our job right now, we're thinking is to build this as an issue, as one for the general industry to focus on. And so that's definitely what we're working on. And when we did our analysis, so, as I said, we did a market review and then we came together as an innovation workshop. We really whittled it down to three things to get this right. One, of course, is reduction, which means efficiency and looking for alternatives to cloaking sites in single-use branded items. Circularity, closing the loop, of course. And the big one, and it's on the cusp of everybody's lips, I guess, and everyone's waiting for this, is innovation. It's the solutions to come through. And we see this like true innovations coming through, but the system's not ready to deal with it. So when we're looking at all new materials, we've got plastic recycling recovery in many areas, although there's big gaps, but throw a brand new, less impactful material and into the mix, and the circular systems don't exist actually to handle it. So it might be good on the manufacturer, it might be fit for purpose in the use, but there's no onward stewardship opportunities to get that circulating through the material system. So yeah, so we're focusing on the innovation side and the systemic side, but also on some practical tools for sports events organisers and the look and overlay people. So this all started with the IOC actually, bringing together a heap of people around this issue. So, UEFA, FIFA, Formula E, ourselves, the Ocean Race, World Sailing, and many others, probably about 20 or 30 of us came together. And then we're each sort of taking the lead in something. So we did this market review and we're hosting these working groups. And UEFA and IOC have commissioned an LCA report. So we've got hard data now on the full life cycle impact of all of the major materials that we have. So that report will be released soon. I can share a link to our sort of pain point analysis report as well, which I'll do when I finish speaking into the chat. So yeah, and now we're working on an innovation playbook. So we're really looking for innovative solutions that are happening out there in the sports sector so that we can share ideas. And we're going to come up with some practical tools like supplier tender criteria and assessment criteria, because building knowledge on, people who aren't sustainability professionals, there are designers, our producers, our site managers or whatever, they're getting material data sheets and they don't know what's good and what's bad, and they have to go on this great big rabbit hole of a journey to try and educate themselves. So we're hoping to build some shortcut tools for the general industry to be able to make good solutions and decisions.
So this is interesting because, obviously we've heard William talking about the coming together of various different organisations around human rights, and Megan, from your perspective, it's looking at kind of circularity and environmental impacts, etc., and the same names come up again and again. The IOC, FIFA, UEFA, all of which seem to have come a long way since, in the last recent years around really taking sustainability seriously. You seem to have very much an industry-wide collaboration. What are the challenges in bringing that very wide and diverse group of organisations together?
I think the inherent challenge in our industry is the fast-paced and extremely high daily work that we have. And so it is a bit piecemeal sometimes, but actually due to COVID, we've been able to put some real big hours into stuff like this. But that being said, everybody's ringing the bell, whether, every industry conference has got something going. Obviously the IOC working with federations and the host cities. The host cities like, London are bringing things to the fore, and then that's, as you say, jumping the fence. So I think that, when I first started in this, which was about 20 years ago, I've written a few books on this subject. I'm up to the 3rd edition now. Hopefully I won't have to do a 4th one. But when I did the 1st edition I was writing it in 2007, I guess, pre-Olympic Games, and I was based in London at that point. And it was hard to find examples. There were a couple of dissertations written on the Sydney Olympics, because I think you can probably drill things back to that Olympics as well as, kickstarting stuff, but there was not much. And then the 2nd edition of my book was 2014, so I was probably writing it 2012, 2013, and certainly a big uptick. But by the 3rd edition, it was cutting room floor in terms of examples, and especially dissertations and studies and PhDs and whatnot. So loads of great stuff to draw on. So if you just judge it by the number of people that contact me on LinkedIn with an idea that they might do a research for their dissertation on events and sustainability, there's a exponential growth as we move forward in time. So that's very rewarding. And the events sector, universities or whatever are embedding this into their course and taking my book on, which is really, really great as well. But, it's good to see that we're seeing industry professionals being turned out with this already. And I think we could all agree that the younger generation have got it in their bones to start with. And it's the older hats that we need to sort of bring into the light. But I think most people are there now. It's just like, tell me how to do it. What do I do? Give me the solutions. And we're seeing the supply chain respond as well, like CSM Live, who are a major producer of look and overlay and a facilitator of look and overlay for many of the big events, are really stepping up in this space. And I must say that they're quite the leader. And I know that they're looking at producing something for the sports sector on how can you allow us to help you help yourself, sort of thing, So really taking it from their point of view, how can they go on the front foot to help the sports events make the right decisions to have the most sustainable look and overlay, rather than do all the thinking on event side and then just give the producer the remit and that's what you've got to produce. So I'm really looking forward to seeing some tricks of the trade there on how we can become more innovative and more efficient.
Yeah, thank you. It's interesting. You mentioned earlier sustainable events professionals, and I would concur with you. I mean, I was involved in the bid for London 2012 back in sort of 2004-05. There were no sustainable event professionals. It wasn't something that existed, and things have certainly moved on a pace since then. And I'd certainly concur when, I was looking at previous Olympic Games. I look at Sydney as a good example of a Green Games, and some good things were done in Sydney. And also Barcelona, because of the way in which, again, the Barcelona Games were used as a regeneration program. So the legacy of, yeah, and Lillehammer, yeah, they even did well on sustainable merchandise, which was interesting.
Van Ock was good as well. Yeah,
yes,
and I
was,
must say, I came to work in London. I was the first full-time sustainable event manager in the sector there, and they had to come to Australia to find someone who was 100% focused on this. So yeah, that was really fun. I went from 15,000 person events to 200,000 person event in one great jump. So it was really interesting to see how to quickly upscale this stuff. But yeah, it's been a thrilling ride. I've nearly given up many times, and then something happens and I get back on that horse.
Excellent. Okay, so thank you, Megan. Again, I have a few questions. I could talk about this stuff all day, but I guess I better hand over now to Luca, and then we'll pick up some general questions from the group going forward. So I'd like to introduce Luca Guzaboka from RightHub, and Luca's got some slides which I'm going to share on his behalf. So Luca, if you'd like to introduce yourself while I share my screen and try and work the technology, and then we'll have some slides and a video from Luca.
Yes, thank you very much, Shaun and Carol, to invite me to this interesting webinar, and hello to everyone. The focus of my presentation is what we have done in MotoGP events as far as concerned the sustainability management of the events. But first of all, I can introduce myself briefly and my company. So I am a former CPO. I used to work in several national and multinational companies. And I have also been involved in sustainable procurement management with some projects in former companies, and as well as today with my company. RightHub is an Italian consultant company. We are based in Milan, north of Italy, and we are focused on four key areas of business and practices. First one is sustainable procurement and supply chain, so nothing to add. The second one is something particular and peculiar for Italy, because we introduced, since we have established the company in 2015, some projects regarding the social procurement and supply diversity. This last one is very common in other parts of the world, especially in UK and in USA. In Italy, of course, is very unknown, and it was very unknown actually in 2015, and we introduced this kind of practice even in Italy, offering to companies to put in place a suppliers portfolio made by social enterprises and social cooperatives, which including people with disabilities or anyway fragile people, disadvantaged people as well. The third part of our job is what actually we are talking about, sustainable and responsible management of events. So our experience started in motorsport and specifically MotoGP, and we are going to talk about. But of course, we are also working in other kind of sectors and for events, for locations, for organizers and suppliers of goods and services for events. The last one, but not the least, is quite interesting for us in terms of social impact, because we work with companies in Italy in order to fulfill a mandatory law to include people, workers with disabilities. And we are specialized because we, work with the companies in order to buy goods and services for social enterprises which includes people with disability. And this it is a tool which allows companies to be in compliance with the Italian law. So it's a kind of match between the social procurement and an obligation coming from the Italian law. So that's just a quick introduction of myself and my company, and sure, we can start the video, which is a nice video, I think also inspiring to start our introduction of the MotoGP sustainable management events. Let's go.
I'm sport. I've existed for thousands of years, bringing millions of people together during some of the world's most monumentous moments. I'm passion, happiness, disaster, triumph. training, victory and defeat. I've left my values imprinted on the world. Teamwork, perseverance, friendship, effort, passion, commitment. Now I want to go further and leave you with my most important legacy. Respect for others, respect for the planet. Solidarity on and off track. Conservation of our resources. Equality. Commitment. I'm sport, and I want to show you I'm capable of changing attitudes. I can convey your culture. Use public transport and reduce emissions. Send a positive message to fans. Raise awareness. Inspire. Educated. I'm sport, and I want to be here forever.
To give you a bit of context, so the International Federation of Motorcycling was really one of the first federations over the world to introduce the environmental code. Maybe, of course, it's obviously the reason of the nature of the motorcycling. But of course, if you look at the fact that almost 30 years ago it has been published the first ever environmental code of the federation, is really something very interesting. And then even recently, 2 or 3 years ago, then the commission internally of the federation has changed the name from Environmental Commission to Sustainability Commission. That was another step forward in order to make a wider the approach of the federation and the motorcycling sector in terms of sustainability, not just environmental, but even social, for instance. Even in terms of visibility and marketing, of course, the federation has put in place green ambassadors campaigns. So few of the, let me say, key riders in different disciplines of the motorcycling became ambassadors of the environmental code and of other initiatives, as well as of the initiative we are going to talk about. We are talking about maybe the first ever sustainable management initiative in the motorcycling, maybe also in the motorsport. It's called KISS program. KISS stands for Keep It Shiny and Sustainable, and started in 2013. And it started and it was launched in Mugello circuit in Italy during the MotoGP, the Grand Prix of Italy in 2013, and it was again the first ever, sustainable event management in motorcycling sector. It was inspired by the organizer of the MotoGP, Dorna, by the Federation of Motorcycling, of course, International Federation of Motorcycling. By the teams, IRTA is the International Association of Racing Teams, of the constructors actually. It means Yamaha, Suzuki, Ducati, KTM, and Honda. They are the main constructor with racing teams. And of course, the first location in which, of course, it has been launched was Mugello, and a very important promoter and sponsor was the CEO of Mugello, Mr. Paolo Poli. And don't forget that Mugello circuit is a property of Ferrari. So behind there was also, a very interesting port of Ferrari company. KISS program, born in Mugello, as I said a few seconds ago, in Italy, but then it has been, executed and exported, let me say, in other countries, in other circuit and racetracks, as well as in Misano, for instance, which is still in Italy, but it has been also executed in Spain, in different circuits of Spain, in the United States, and even outside the MotoGP discipline, and has been executed in, for instance, in Varkaus and Tampere. There were championship and events in the speedway discipline, but as well as in Andorra with trial, for instance, also in enduro disciplines, and in South America. We are talking about Colombia and Chile, if I don't remember bad, but anyway, you see that, of course, the KISS program has been implemented in the last 7 years in different countries, different disciplines, and of course in different contests, because you see in racetrack, which are a permanent circuit, but even outside in not permanent circuit, but in off-road situations. In terms of the scope of activities, initiatives, and issues that the KISS program covers, I have put some slides together just to give you a snapshot. But of course, I can't give you a very comprehensive list of things we do in the KISS program. For instance, the next slide show you which is the contest. Just an example of Mugello circuit. So the concept is which we apply the KISS program. The MotoGP Grand Prix of Italy actually is a 3 days event long, but one of the peculiarity in Mugello circuit is that the circuit is open 24 hours on 24 hours for 4 days, because the spectators can go inside camping, or even with motorhomes and campers, and the number you can see on my slides is very high. So we are talking about 3,000 campers inside the circuit, which create a big issue in terms, for instance, waste management. The number of spectators are around 160,000, so it's a huge number of spectators in just 3 days. In terms of food and beverage kiosk, there are 25 approximately points of beverage and food deliveries inside the circuit. In terms of paddock and hospitalities, it's also complex because it's larger than, for instance, the Formula One paddock and hospitalities numbers. So we are talking about more than 40 teams of hospitalities and more than 10 private hospitalities in the offices and spaces of the circuit. So if you look at the numbers and the complexity, it's really challenging to put in place something about a sustainable event, but since 2013 many things has been done, and I can give you some examples in the next slides. For instance, waste management. Of course, there are waste bins around the circuits with different colors for different kind of waste. But what we boosted since the first edition in Mugello specifically, due to the fact that there are also people camping and with motorhomes, we launched a distribution of waste management kits in which there are some bags with different colors and with a instruction leaflet in order to raise awareness about the proper and right waste disposal. And this was really a very interesting initiative, which has been also replicated year by year. Approximately, just to give you a number, we give away actually each year a number of kits which are around 20,000 pieces. So it's a quite intensive work even for our team to distribute and to inform people. Of course, I have to add that there are around the circuit, internally the circuit, some info points or info desk where my team, of course, work with the teams as well, but especially with the spectators to raise awareness about issues of sustainable management. Well, some kind pictures about our engagement activities with VIPs or with ordinary people, spectators, with teams, with riders. That's another key part of our job, which is not just a marketing, let me say, aspect, but it's very important because people can be more influenced by For instance, an activity done with the riders, and the fans are really looking at what the riders of MotoGP done, even outside the circuit and outside the competition. So, as I mentioned before, they are ambassadors and even ambassadors of the KISS program as well. What we do also is something very important, because when we engage sponsors and supporters, we also create around some specific issues, some specific call to action and campaigns. I just put here a couple of examples. The first one is here with the Sky racing team, which is the racing team of Valentino Rossi. And the riders, the young riders, were, ambassadors of the Sky Ocean Rescue campaign during the Misano MotoGP event and inside the KISS program. So we partnered between, the Sky Ocean Rescue campaign in Italy during the event, as well as with the KISS program. So, and we put in place, of course, many actions in order to reduce the use of plastics and, primarily to recycle the PET plastic bottles during the events. And then we exchange with some gift to the people according to the number of bottles or to the rewarding premium we put in place with the revending machine. The next slide is the second example of cooperation with companies. In that case, it's again an issue of recycling of packaging. This is the aluminum cans packaging, and with Red Bull company, which is a very well-known energy drinks company and very well present in motorsport sector, definitely. And we put in place a specific call to action for spectators inside the circuit and even outside the circuit, with a couple of teams of people, of our staff, going around the circuit and inside the circuit among the spectators in order to raise awareness about the circular economy in terms of aluminum cans cycling, and with this kind of packages behind the shoulders in order to invite the spectators to put in the aluminum cans empty. Just to give you a number, during the weekend of MotoGP in Misano, we collected more than 20,000 aluminum cans, which has been then, delivered to a proper recycling system and process. The next slide is around what we do in terms of circular economy, in addition to what I said before. So we also work very substantially with teams in order to introduce some circular economy practice, starting from the cooking oil. Before we started this program, the cooking oil in some cases was not really disposed in the proper way, and I can't say more than this, but you can imagine. Since we started the KISS program, of course, we put in place a system of collection of cooking oil. We distribute ad hoc bins, and then we cooperate with an external company which transform the exhausted cooking oil in biofuel, or it can be used also to produce renewable energy. This is an example. The second example is coffee grounds. Of course, in Italy especially, we drink a lot of coffee, and we produce a lot of coffee grounds. And in this case, we discovered a very interesting, way to recycle coffee grounds. So with social enterprises, we collected coffee grounds from the hospitalities. So it means a huge amount of coffee grounds, let me say, and we deliver to the social enterprise, which transform the coffee grounds in compost for the cultivation of edible mushrooms. There is a environmental impact positive in this case, but even there is a social impact because the social enterprises includes people with workers with disabilities. So it's a second positive effect of our interesting initiative. The third one, which I can show you, is the merchandising or the part of the promotional items we use to promote our programs. In the picture, you can see some examples. For instance, we give away recycled plastic portable ashtrays because, of course, we also did a campaign against the littering of cigarette butts. And we gave away even the portable ashtrays made by recycled plastics. The same with the beach scoops for kids made by recycled plastics. And with aluminium, for instance, the rulers or the pencil sharpeners, even in order to engage kids during the events. And we used to minimize paper, materials. But when we use some paper materials, for instance, the instruction for the waste management, we print it on FSC or recycled paper, or FSC certification of recycled papers. Again, another social and environmental impact is that we introduced the food surplus collection across the hospitalities. Again, another demonstration of the change in terms of culture as well as in terms of operation, because when we started to see that after the weekends and actually on Sunday evening after the race, all the hospitalities wasted a lot of foods, cooked foods, but even foods or still in the package, in the original package. We were really very, astonished about that. And the next year, the following year, we started to collect the food waste on Saturday night and on Sunday night. And approximately since we started this kind of activity, every weekends and every events, we collected something more than 2,500 meals, which are donated to the local, communities where there are people in need, of course. And this is another very impactful and, beneficial initiative we put in place. This is one with Valentino Rossi and Jorge Lorenzo of the Yamamoto racing team, just to give you another aspect of our wide portfolio of initiative of this program is the fundraising campaign example. This was done a few years ago when, unfortunately, the earthquake hit the central part of Italy, and we raised more than 60,000 euro, which was donated to the people needs in that case. The last slide, which is the following, represents our effort also to include people with disability. Specifically, of course, we offer a very unique moment for people with disability in walking across the pit lane on Thursday, and all the teams and riders and team managers open the garages and show off the bikes and meet the people, sign the autographs. So it is also very emotional and very interesting initiative we put in place during the events. So just the next slide to share that if you want any kind of other further information, figures, numbers, statistics, and of course your report, you have a look at the two websites, specifically kidsmugello.com and kidsmisano.com. And with the last slides, just say hello and thanks for your attention from many of our testimonials and ambassadors we meet every weekend, so where we put in place the KISS program. Yeah.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, Luca.
For the opportunity. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, I've got a few questions of my own. If I can maybe start with Luca and then open up to the other speakers. Personality culture. Luca, you mentioned ambassadors, and in motorsport in particular, in recent months, we've heard personalities like Lewis Hamilton being very vocal around, certainly around racism, but also around environmental impacts, climate change. How important is it that these big personalities from sport actually speak out on these issues?
Actually, it's something very obvious, but I can tell you that when we involve riders very well known, like Marc Marquez or Valentino Rossi or others, of course, people can match their passionate for the competition and for the riders, and the passion for the environmental or sustainability matters. So that make things more, let me say, easier. And ordinary people, the farm, can really more, available, more willing to discuss this kind of matter when they are promoted by their, loved riders. Yeah.
And Megan, do you have a perspective on that in terms of the message that comes out from key figures and recognised figures in sport?
Yeah, absolutely. And in fact, we're going through a training process at the moment to help our sailors have the knowledge and the talking points and define their authentic voice. I think that's really important. And, when we've done workshops with our sailors, they've said that we can't talk about this, we can't be advocates unless we can be credible. So that they know what they're talking about and authentic. So definitely that, they've got their own house in order first. So we work on that with them as well. They're highly aware of that. And I know that there'd be many athletes out there that would feel the same. And, we've been looking actually for a really great, I guess, relatable trainer for sports people and athletes, especially the sailors. They're gnarly characters, and you can't have a pointy head scientist trying to tell them what's what. So that we're looking for somebody that's that they can relate to. So I think that until athletes are really confident in the topic, can find their authentic voice, and definitely have their house in order or are in the process of doing so.
So that's an interesting point about credibility. So it's not enough for people just to kind of spout off about the subject. There needs to be some knowledge and some gravitas behind it as well. No, that's great. Thank you. William, do you have a perspective from a human rights point of view on characters, personalities?
I think it's aligned, because the most powerful messaging that you see from athletes on these issues are things that they have first-hand experience of, that they care about, and that they're best placed to articulate. And you see that in some of the more successful athlete activism we've seen in the last 6 to 12 months. There's been a real kind of heightened degree of athlete activism, and partly that's because these are issues that athletes really themselves have often experienced or feel strongly about, whether it's Black Lives Matter in the US and the action taken by teams started there that's now spread in many parts of the world. I think we've all sort of been blown away by Marcus Rashford's campaigning in the UK with respect to school meals. And speaking from that sort of point of authenticity is very powerful, and I think that's the right approach to make sure that those who have a voice are well briefed and supported in using it, to make sure that it's got that depth to the points that are being made, and they can stand up for them. And that really, I think, is key for sport, because it's athletes whose rights are often most at risk in sport, and who care often the most that sport's responsible to. So enabling that and working with athletes and their representatives and unions and others is important for us in our work, for sure.
Brilliant, thank you. And if I can maybe come back to Megan, you talked about, and also a question for Luca as well, I guess. You talked about overlay and looking at environmental standards and circular economy and those sorts of issues. In your world, where are you at with human rights and labour standards in supply chains and the sort of ethical aspects of materials?
Of course, it's naturally part of the spectrum of sustainability attributes to look at. It's as simple as that. I think if any event organiser has taken the effort to produce a supplier code of conduct or a sustainable sourcing code or policy or whatever, they won't have missed this out. And as we know, with murky supply chains, it's all about being able to have that transparency, looking at ILO and other different sector supply chain areas. And obviously, the worker welfare and human rights, it's more direct, especially with the big events with displacement of people, as you say, and almost indentured workforces in some cases. So yeah, but in the sort of the sense, the normal scale event that's looking at supply chain, yeah, absolutely. We back in 2011 we developed an event, organised a sector supplement for the GRI, for the event sector through GRI, and London 2012 were part of that. And we realised at that point that there was no disclosures that were relevant to the supply chain as we use the supply chain. So we actually developed a heap of new disclosures, I guess, but with the G4 and onwards updates, there's a whole procurement, social and environmental elements to the supply chain now in the standards. So yeah, I think the early leaders have been on this for a long time.
Yeah, you mentioned disclosure, and certainly one of the big debates that I had with London 2012 around disclosure of manufacturing locations, and that at the time commercially was something very difficult to achieve. And if I look at William's world, in the world of trade unions, the trade unions will say the holy grail is knowing where stuff is made. Where is the sports sector in terms of, and I know, I think William mentioned Adidas, and they came out and said, yeah, we're happy to tell you where everything is made for London 2012, but not all suppliers were prepared to do that. Where's the event sector in terms of that sort of level of transparency now?
Yeah, well, obviously with apparel and sports sector, there wouldn't be a major sports event without an apparel partner. And the apparel fashion industry is quite mature in this. Obviously, it went through its speed humps or whatever along the way, but we're certainly well down the path. And I think there was, there were the barriers because of the protection from an IP point of view of their suppliers. So that added to it, not wanting to fully disclose. So I guess we piggyback on the maturity of the textile and apparel sector. In other sectors, our big materials look and overlay is that's one we're tackling now, obviously. Food is a massive one, and that's no different to the rest of the world and all of the other sectors. Fuel is an interesting one. I worked on an event where we were trying to source green diesel, which was manufactured in Europe for a European event, and through a sponsorship set up with a global oil company, that we had to use their supply chain, and that we actually traced the fuel back to obviously the Middle East. So that was an interesting one, and I think that's one that is a big issue in the sports and all event sector, but particularly in sports, is where sponsorship arrangements could hinder best practice. And so, there's a fair amount of pushing back, but it's all about design it in the first place. So put some circles around those areas that you don't want to partner with because they're too fraught. Put in non-exclusivity in terms of supplier arrangements. If it turns out, especially with a global event like the ocean race, we need to be very mindful of what's available in each of our destinations when we're looking at our global partners. If they come with a solution and then travelling that solution around as an operational solution, needs to be looked at very carefully, and we do that. So I think another one of the angles of approach that we've got with Look and Overlay is actually obviously speaking to the brands and the sponsors. And we hope to do a workshop with some key brands that, activate it at sports properties and say, okay, what can be different ways to leverage your brand and, build your social license and have your touch points with the audience and all the things that doesn't include painting your logo across acres of single-use textiles. So that's going to be a fun one to have, and God knows what the solution is going to be, but we look forward to the innovations that might come down the pipeline.
Thank you. Lots of issues to explore in there. If I can maybe ask William, in terms of this question of disclosure, where do you see the world of sport being at in terms of transparency of supply chains and manufacturing locations in particular?
No, I think, as you mentioned there, from the experience of London 2012, it's if it might not be possible in all circumstances, certainly looking for these even greater disclosures and transparency around sporting events is something that we should seek to provide that assurance. And I think it goes beyond just embedding human rights in sustainable sourcing, because it's also, if you look at it from a human rights perspective, it's about the level of stakeholder engagement that takes place in determining policies and approaches. It's really engaging with affected people in a way that gives them a voice in how the activities and impacts of the event are designed. And it's also about the sort of real accountability and providing access to remedy where things might go wrong. And that means, the grievance mechanisms are not seen as a source of complaints, but also just a way to understand the supply chain, a way to understand what's going on, a way to understand the issues that complaints are sought out, really, to give that extra context in how things are working further down the chain, and that those mechanisms are really accessible, that they're effective, that they're independent. That kind of additional sort of human rights thinking and taking a human rights approach to that stakeholder engagement and dealing with complaints and grievances really, to me, is where our energy should be, especially to build on all the work that's been done in the past on sustainability and sourcing. For me, those would be two priorities.
Okay, thank you. We're coming close to the end of the session, so if I've got a couple of slightly more general questions. William, you mentioned, where in the world these major events are going, and to a degree that there's some element of public opinion against hosting major sporting events and being a host city. And certainly from what I read in the press, it seems that public opinion in Japan around the Tokyo Olympics is actually very negative. Where does that go in the future? You mentioned that, and I've heard one of your colleagues, John Morrison, saying we'll end up with sporting events only happening in places where there isn't a democracy. If I can maybe start with William and ask Megan and Luca to come in, do we feel that the major sport event is almost a sunset industry? Is it something that may happen less in the future?
I think that is a critical question, and I think there's every prospect that sports events are increasingly going to places that have poor human rights records, but I don't think that's inevitable. I think there's a great deal of trust to be rebuilt, I think, and part of that means that these very powerful sporting organizations that rely a lot on self-governance and rely on the independence and autonomy of sport open up and give a little power away to stakeholders, to communities, to participants, to those who are part of the delivery and success of the events. And that means perhaps, giving away some of that privilege and that power, inviting independent scrutiny, independent remedy processes, and that way of holding to account some of the things we've seen go wrong in sports. And a lot of it comes back to governance, that a lot of the governance in sport is fairly outdated. A lot of the levels of diversity and the demographics in sport are still very out of date and unchallenged. And these types of things have moved on a lot, particularly in the private sector over the last 10, 15 years, and perhaps not so much in sport. And if we see that kind of work on governance and embedding the right policies and the right practices at the very top of sports bodies, I think that's the start of, plus bringing in this kind of independent scrutiny and not necessarily oversight, but scrutiny and participation, then you start to rebuild that trust. And I think that makes sports events more attractive to have in many parts of the world. So just some initial ideas, Shaun.
Thanks, William. Megan, do you have a view on host cities, the popularity, etc., of events?
Yeah, for sure. I think, as we emerge into our new normal and we understand what's going to happen in the next year or two, this is going to frame everything. We'll realise what we really need and what we can do without. And we all know that we need community cohesion and we need celebration and we need to come together. But there will be a lot of events that will drop off the peripheries. And I think that without question, events must have a social license to operate. They must be purpose-driven or purpose-led. there needs to be an authentic reason for them to exist. Alongside that, they must be climate responsible. They must be circular. Obviously, they must be COVID safe. And if you don't have those things, and as you say, you haven't built the trust and you haven't got a very well scrutinized reason for being that balances all of the use of resources, all the things, then yeah, I think we're looking at dinosaurs. I'm confident that our industry was on that trajectory anyway. And I think what we were responding to was the appetite of the general population for them to consume those experiences. And so I think that alongside this potentially may come a little bit of a reboot on people's approaches to this. So I think there's huge value in having these global sports events and all events and festivals. But I think there's going to be some serious reflection on the best way to deliver these in the future.
We'll all need these opportunities to come together after this year or more at home as well. So let's hope we have these opportunities to be together.
Yeah, we might go through a little bit of a dark time in terms of sustainable event management for a couple of years while everyone lets loose and doesn't care, and then we get our house in order again. Yeah. And just all of the sustainable event managers will just be breaking out in hives everywhere because everyone's just throwing caution to the wind.
Can I add something?
Yes, Luca, I was going to say, talking of dinosaurs, Luca, and climate responsible events, a bunch of people racing around the track burning a lot of fossil fuels. What's that all about? Luca?
I agree with the Megan speech around the future of the events in general and not just sport. But as far as concerned the motorsport, for instance, sector, what we have seen the last couple of years, 3 years, is a ramp up of interest in making the events more sustainable. And specifically because we also on the ISO 21221, we have seen an increase of interest in making things, following international, standard requirements. And it means also disclose numbers, figures, objectives, and plans. And for instance, at the moment we are working on a couple of very important projects in motorsport in order to implement a sustainable management system based on ISO 21221 and of course even achieving the certification. So things are changing. I mean, we have seen, for instance, Formula One publish the first ever sustainability strategy end of 2019. The International Federation of Automobile published the first environmental strategy just beginning of January. We see many things changing. Of course, it will take not just a year, but it will take more than a year because many things are around the sport and specifically the motorsport sectors. But the journey is there. Yeah.
Brilliant, thank you, Luca. We're coming to the end of our time, so I guess I'm going to have to wrap there and thank all of our speakers. I certainly really enjoyed the conversation. I hope our audience did too. As we said earlier, we are recording this event, and we will be putting out an edited version of the recording that will be available up on the ISO 2400 website. So thanks everybody for your participation. Thanks very much again to our speakers. Enjoy the rest of your day or enjoy your evening or night, Megan, in Australia, and we hope to see you again soon. Thanks very much, everybody.